Last March, I announced that Yuka and I would be riding a pretty unusual bike for 2020. It was the Forbidden Druid, and you guys were pretty stoked on it, judging by how many people watched that video. On first glance, most will notice that this bike isn't your typical mountain bike. The chain takes a pretty unusual path to the rear wheel, and of course, there was a good reason for that. It has a high pivot suspension design, which is a pretty hot topic in the mountain bike world these days. But we'll get to that. The other unique, but not so obvious feature on the bike were the wheels that I chose. The Noble TR37 with Onyx hubs. A few people on the trail have noticed the wavy pattern in the rim, and I'm sure all of you have noticed that silent rear hub in the videos as well.
Totally silent.
And after 7 months of hard riding on all types of terrain, I've got a pretty good idea of what the bike can do. So I asked on Instagram, YouTube, and Patreon what you guys wanted to know about the bike. And oh boy, did I ever get what I asked for. Within a few hours, I was overwhelmed with hundreds of questions. But by far, you guys really wanted to know about the high pivot suspension design. But before we dive into your questions, I should probably explain what a high pivot is and what it actually does. On most mountain bikes, you'll see that they'll have the main pivot down low near the cranks. While this has been working well on mountain bikes for a long time, it also means that when your rear wheel hits a rock, the suspension rotates forward in the opposite direction the rock is moving. With a high pivot system, the suspension actually rotates rearward in the same direction of travel as the rock, doing more to absorb the impact. This is also the reason why the chain takes such an unusual path. If the bike had a normal chain setup, it would pull on the chain ring, creating what's called pedal kickback. So Forbidden solved this by putting an idler pulley up near the pivot and ran the chain around it.
Alright, so now that we have the basics sorted out, let's get to the questions. So the first question is the rollover resistance significantly decreased with the high pivot design? So this is basically asking, does it do what it says on the box? And yeah, it does. It works great. So my last bike was a 150 millimeter enduro bike, and this bike is a 130 millimeter trail bike. And I would say this bike does a better job at sucking up the bumps than my previous bike did. It really does smooth out the trail. So our second question is, have you encountered any problems with the high pivot? So no problems at all. Last summer we took it apart, greased everything up, put it back together. It's running really good. No reliability issues at all. So the next question is asking about maintenance in a high pivot point drivetrain. So obviously you have extra stuff in the drivetrain, so the idler pulley becomes part of your drivetrain. So when I went to replace my chain and cassette last summer, I also replaced the idler, which is really easy. It's just like a single bolt. Also, when I first bought the bike, I bought 2 chains because the chain is actually longer than a normal chain. So I used one complete chain and then part of the second chain. And then when I replaced the chain in the summer, I used one complete new chain and then just a little portion of that second chain I bought originally. Does it feel closer to a trail bike or an enduro? So the bike has 130 millimeters of travel, which puts it in the trail bike category. But to be honest, to me, it feels more like an enduro bike. In my opinion, it's just more capable and more aggressive than your average trail bike. And I'd say it feels closer to an enduro bike than a trail bike. So the next question from Patreon, hey Eric, would you rather have a longer travel bike with your riding style? And then he goes on to say that I ride it with other people on enduro bikes and downhill bikes, and I seem to be doing fine. It's a good question. That was definitely one of my first concerns when I contacted Forbidden. It was definitely on the shorter travel side of things, and it was definitely going to be the shortest travel bike that I would have ridden on a daily basis. But then I got on the bike and it was awesome and it was fine, and I was like, okay, I made the right decision for sure. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with 130 mil. And you may have seen online that Forbidden is actually testing a prototype bike, which has more travel. If it ever comes down to it, deciding between the newer, longer travel bike and this one would be a really hard decision actually, because I'm really happy with this, and it's pretty rare when I actually feel overwhelmed on this bike. So right now I'm really happy with this setup. So the next question is from somebody that really knows what they're talking about. They're asking if I've tried the Ziggy Link to run it as a mullet. So to explain it a little bit, my bike has 29-inch wheels on both sides. When someone turns their bike into a mullet bike, they actually put a smaller wheel on the back, a 27.5. And the reason people want to install a smaller wheel on the back is because it'll make the bike handle a little faster, a little quicker, while keeping the rollover of the bigger front tire. So what that means is that the back of the bike actually gets lower, and your pedals would be more likely to hit rocks and stuff because they would be actually closer to the ground. So what Forbidden has done is they made a link that actually brings the bike back up, back to where it should be, to allow you to run a smaller wheel in the back properly. So I actually have that link, but I haven't installed it yet because of this. But I'm actually really curious to see how the bike would handle with a smaller wheel. But my wife Yuka's installed it and she loves it. But the main reason is because she's a shorter rider and it gives her more butt clearance in the back. So the next question is from Patreon. Is the idler friction noticeable on the uphills? So everything in your drivetrain is going to produce some amount of friction. So like the chain interfacing with the cassette and the chain interfacing with the chainring and all the bearings and all the pulleys. And basically they're asking, does the extra idler pulley add a lot of friction? So I guess my answer to that question is I don't notice it. But when you have a new chain on there, you can definitely hear it just humming away a little bit. But once the drivetrain breaks in, you don't really hear it. Technically, if you measured it, it would add a little bit of drag, but I don't think it's much. So the next question is, how is the pedaling platform for climbing? Does it require a lockout or is it efficient while grippy? So just to explain this a little bit, any full suspension mountain bike is going to have a bit of bob when you pedal. And that's just because the suspension is working and you're putting force in, so it's just going to bob a little. And certain bikes are better at this and certain bikes are worse at this. And then most bikes have a lockout on the shock which stops the suspension from moving, allowing you to climb more efficiently. So in every bike I've had before this bike, I've always used that lockout to lock out the suspension. But on this bike, I don't use it ever. The suspension is really efficient, it doesn't really bob, and there's plenty of grip on the climbs. Did it make you gain confidence compared to previous bikes? So I definitely think it has, but there's a lot of variables there. Like the tires and suspension this year are really good, and I've been riding with my friend Antoine this summer, who's been towing me into everything. So it's been a great summer. And while I've had this bike, I haven't really been crashing much, well, except for this. So that really gives me a lot of confidence, and I really feel like me and the bike get along really well. And in fact, I don't think I've crashed enough to make a blooper reel this year, so. How are the wheels holding up, seeing as you cased on some jumps and even had a few crashes? Yeah, I definitely cased a few jumps and I definitely had a few crashes, including this one. And yeah, the wheels have been great actually. They've been super reliable and yeah, I'm really happy with them. Actually, when my wife switched to the mullet setup and got that new 27.5 wheel from Noble, she went out to do some jumps and cased one really bad, but the wheel was fine. Do the new carbon wheels actually feel different to the older ones? Different vertical compliance? Yeah, so these are the TR37s and my last set were the TR38. So these have a bit of a thinner profile than my last set. So they definitely have a bit more of a damped feel, but the last set were also really good. And to be honest, I'd run either set. Next question, how does your bike look after the crash? It looks a lot better than I do. Actually, the bike was fine. It just tomahawked down the hill and I rode it out after, so no problems there. So the next question is it what you would choose to ride if you weren't sponsored by them? So Forbidden, I approached them because I was really interested in their bike and that's the bike I wanted to ride. So yeah, if I wasn't sponsored by them, I'd probably ride their bike. And as for Noble, yeah, I've been riding Noble for a long time now and I think they're fantastic. They make a great product. But I will admit that the owner, Trevor, is a friend of mine for a long time now from my teenage days. But yeah, I have no problems with the wheels and I'm actually really happy to ride them. Do you think high pivot is the future or is it too complicated of a solution to take off? I think it's great. And to be honest, I'm really only interested in high pivot bikes now. If you look at the mountain bike media, there's a lot of companies that are starting to develop high pivot mountain bikes now. And I think there's a good reason for it. I think they work really well. And as for the complication, well, obviously, yeah, there's the idler, but that's not really a big deal. And the suspension itself only has 8 bearings in it, whereas a lot of bikes will have 12 or more, like the Stump Jumper. So yeah, I don't think it's actually complicated. Do you really need a high pivot point bike? No, you don't really need a high pivot point bike. If you have any mountain bike, you should go out and ride it, and you should have fun on it. But pretty much every bike is going to get the job done. It's just that some bikes are going to do the job better than others. And I think this bike does a really great job. But it's really up to you. And that'll be it for the questions. Thanks to the hundreds of people that asked questions. Sorry I couldn't get to them all. A lot of them were duplicates, so hopefully I answered a lot of your questions with this video. And as you might have guessed by now, I really like this bike. Obviously I'm working with Forbidden and Noble, but I have to say I really do like this bike. It's my favorite bike I've ever owned, and I just can't wait to ride it again and get this damn cast off. But as always, thanks for watching, and stay gnarly.